Okay, let's be real for a second. I bet you've at least heard the whispers about the moon landing being faked.
Right.
This whole giant hoax idea.
Yeah, it's one of those things that just never seems to go away.
Totally. So today we're doing a deep dive into this whole thing. We'll look at what the conspiracy theorists are saying, and then we'll break down the science that debunks their claims.
It should be fun.
For sure. And remember, we're not trying to tell you what to believe here. It's more about learning to think critically, especially when you hear these really out there claims.
Exactly.
To guide us, we're using this document called Pasted Text, specifically a section called The Moon Landing, a debate on the moon landing conspiracy. It lays out both sides of the argument really well.
Yeah, it gives you a good feel for the controversy that still surrounds this event all these years later.
So think about that iconic image of the American flag planted on the moon. You know the one. Desolate landscape, black sky, and there's the flag waving in the breeze. But hold on, there's no atmosphere on the moon. So where's the breeze coming from? What's going on there?
That's exactly what a lot of conspiracy theorists jump on. They'll say, see? A waving flag. It had to have been filmed on Earth. But the real story is way more interesting.
I'm all ears.
So they wanted the flag to fly out nice and proud, right?
Yeah.
To do that, they mounted it on a telescopic pole, kind of like a tent pole, across the top.
Okay, makes sense.
When they planted it, they had to twist that pole into the ground, and that twisting is what caused the rippling.
Ah, so it's not wind, it's the planting motion. But then why do the ripples just stay there?
Because there's no air on the moon to stop them.
Makes sense.
Here on Earth, any flag would eventually settle down because the air slows it down. But on the moon, nothing to stop the rippling, so it just keeps going.
Wow, that's a good point. Okay, what about the shadows in the moon landing pictures?
What about them?
Well, conspiracy theorists point out that the shadows from the astronauts and their stuff aren't all parallel. Uh-huh.
They say that means there must have been multiple light sources, like you'd have on a movie set. So could that be proof of studio lighting?
You know, it's true that if you had a perfectly flat surface and one light source, like the sun, the shadows would be parallel. But the lunar surface, definitely not flat.
Right, craters and all that.
Exactly. You've got craters, hills, all sorts of uneven terrain. Plus, that lunar dust is super reflective.
Yeah, it almost grows.
It creates these crazy shadow patterns that you just wouldn't see here on Earth.
So basically, our Earth-based intuition about how shadows work doesn't really apply on the moon.
Yeah, our brains are kind of wired to expect shadows to behave a certain way. But the moon plays by different rules.
All right, here's one that's always bugged me. If the moon landing was real, why aren't there stars in the background of the pictures?
Good question.
Space should be full of stars, right? So does that mean they were filming in a studio? Not necessarily. It all comes down to how cameras work, especially when you're dealing with tricky lighting. The astronauts' cameras were set up to capture the bright lunar surface.
Right, to get all the detail.
Exactly. They need a fast shutter speed and a small aperture. Now, stars are super faint compared to the sunlit moon. So to capture stars, you'd need a much longer exposure, which would have overexposed everything else. You know, the astronauts, the landscape.
It'd be a big white blur.
Exactly.
So it was a trade-off. Either capture the detail on the moon or try to get those faint stars. Okay, here's something that worries even people who don't believe in the conspiracies. We know those Van Allen radiation belts around Earth are super dangerous. How did the astronauts survive going through them on their way to the moon?
Well, it's true those belts are a big deal,
Huh.
but NASA knew that and planned the mission to minimize the risk.
How did they do that?
Well, first, they picked a flight path for Apollo that spent less time in the most intense parts of the radiation belts. Think of it like hiking through a mountain range. You'd avoid the highest, most dangerous peaks, right?
Smart move. But they were still exposed to some radiation, even on a safer route, right?
Yes, some. That's where the spacecraft's shielding came in. It was designed to protect the astronauts.
Like a little radiation bunker.
Pretty much. And their speed helped, too.
Yeah.
The faster they went through the belts, the less time they spent exposed.
Okay, so it was a combination of things. A planned route, the spacecraft's protection, and their speed.
Yeah, they really did think of everything.
All right, so let's bring in the Cold War.
Okay.
The U.S. and Soviet Union were in a serious space race.
Yeah,
Right, absolutely. And the Soviets had their own moon program. So if the U.S. faked the landing, wouldn't the Soviets have called them out on it? Wouldn't they have told the world?
It's a good point. And it's important to remember the political climate back then. The Soviets were watching the U.S. space program like a hawk.
I bet they were.
They had the tech to track launches, listen to radio transmissions, all that. They knew exactly what was going on.
So why did they say anything if they were watching so closely?
Well, here's a thought. Maybe they just couldn't do it themselves and decided to stay quiet rather than admit they were falling behind.
So basically, just because you can't do something doesn't mean it's fake.
Exactly. It might just mean you haven't figured it out yet. And think about it. Calling out your rival on something huge like that could backfire if you don't have proof.
So the Soviets being quiet might have been more about Cold War politics than believing the moon landing was fake. Okay, so we've talked about some of the claims about the moon landing and how science can debunk them. But before we move on, I think it's important to ask why people believe these theories in the first place. What's going on there?
It's a great question, and it's complicated. I don't think it always comes down to a lack of scientific knowledge. Sometimes it's more about deeper psychological needs.
Deeper needs, huh? Like,
Well, think about it. The world can feel pretty uncertain and chaotic. Conspiracy theories can offer a sense of certainty, a feeling of knowing something that everyone else supposedly doesn't. It can feel good to think you have access to this hidden knowledge, this truth that most people miss.
so it's about feeling like you're in the know, not being tricked by the powers that be.
Yeah.
But wouldn't accepting the moon landing, this incredible human achievement, feel more empowering than holding on to the idea that it was all a lie?
You could think so, wouldn't you? And for lots of people, it does. But for some, the idea that a government agency, which we often see as flawed and bureaucratic, could pull off something this huge might feel even more uncomfortable than believing it was faked.
Like it's a defense mechanism against feeling small and insignificant in the face of something amazing.
Maybe. It really highlights how much our emotions play into what we believe. Our beliefs are tied to who we think we are and where we fit in the world.
That's deep.
It is. But before we get too lost in the psychology of conspiracy thinking, how about we get back to some more specific claims about the moon landing?
Sounds good to me. Where do we go from here?
Well, what about the claims about Stanley Kubrick and the supposed clues hidden in his movies, especially 2001, A Space Odyssey and The Shining?
Oh, yeah, the whole Kubrick connection.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So, some people think that Kubrick, the master filmmaker known for his visual effects, was secretly hired by NASA to direct the fake moon landing footage. What's the logic behind that theory?
Basically, the idea is that if you wanted to fake a moon landing back in the 60s, Kubrick would have been the guy to do it.
He was the best, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And people who believe this theory point to what they see as hidden messages in his films, especially The Shining, as proof he was involved.
Okay, so what kind of clues are we talking about? Like, what makes them think these movies are secretly about the moon landing?
Well, one of the big ones is that Apollo 11 sweater that Danny wears in The Shining, the little kid. Conspiracy theorists think it's a clear sign, like Kubrick winking at people who know the truth.
But couldn't it just be a coincidence? Like, maybe the costume designer just liked the sweater?
Yeah, that's the thing with a lot of these so-called clues. It's all about how you interpret them, and they tend to ignore simpler explanations.
It's like they're trying to find meaning where there isn't any.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of confirmation bias. You start with a belief, and then you just pick and choose the evidence that supports it, ignoring anything that doesn't fit.
So even if we say, okay, maybe Kubrick was involved, wouldn't tons of people have had to be in on it? Hundreds, maybe thousands? How could they keep something that big a secret for so long?
That's one of the biggest problems with this theory. To fake something like that, you'd need a massive team. Filmmakers, set designers, technicians, actors, not to mention everyone at NASA who would have to go along with it. Keeping a secret that huge with so many people for over 50 years, it's just not very likely.
Yeah, you'd think someone would have cracked by now, spilled the beans, come forward with some real proof.
Right. You'd think so, especially with all the attention and maybe even money they could get for being a whistleblower. But even with all the claims over the years, no real evidence has ever come out.
Okay, so we've looked at some specific things about the moon landing and how science debunks them. But let's step back for a minute. What do you think about why people are drawn to these conspiracy theories in the first place?
It's an interesting question, and it's complicated. It's not always just about not understanding the science. I think a lot of times it has to do with psychology, with deeper needs.
What do you mean, deeper needs?
Well, think about it. We live in a world that often feels unpredictable and confusing. Conspiracy theories offer a sense of certainty, a feeling of knowing something that most people don't, a hidden truth that goes against what we're told to believe. It can be appealing to feel like you're not being fooled by the people in power, you know?
So it's like you feel empowered in a world that often makes you feel powerless.
Right. But wouldn't accepting the moon landing, this huge accomplishment for humanity,
Mm.
feel even more empowering?
Logically, yes.
But for some people, the enormity of it, this amazing thing, is too much. It's easier to believe it was all fake than to accept that a government agency, with all its problems, could actually do something so incredible.
So it's like the truth is too much to handle, so they find comfort in a simpler, even if it's false, explanation.
It's very human. We like our stories to be neat and easy to understand. Sometimes a conspiracy theory, even a crazy one, fits that better than real life, which is messy and complicated.
So how do we deal with this? How do we encourage people to be skeptical of big claims without making them feel like we're putting them down?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a tough balance. I think it starts with encouraging healthy skepticism, where questioning things and looking at evidence is seen as a good thing, not a threat.
So not being cynical or distrusting everything, but being curious and thinking critically.
Right. Being willing to change your mind when new information comes up,
Yeah.
and realizing that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay.
Yeah, there's something beautiful about that. Admitting we don't know everything and approaching the unknown with curiosity and humility.
I agree. And maybe what's even more inspiring than any conspiracy theory is appreciating the amazing things humans have done.
Like landing on the moon, walking on another world. When you really think about it, that's mind-blowing.
Totally. It shows what we can achieve when we work together, use our brains, and never give up. So we've explored the arguments, the evidence, and even the psychology behind the moon landing conspiracy theories. What are your thoughts? What have you learned from this deep dive? Where do we go from here?
Okay, so for everyone listening out there, why does any of this matter? Why are we spending time debunking moon landing conspiracies?
It goes beyond just the moon landing itself. It's really about practicing those critical thinking skills we were talking about.
Right.
Those skills are useful for all sorts of things. You can use them when you're reading a news story, researching something you want to buy, or even making decisions about your health.
So it's about being a smarter, more informed person in general.
Exactly. And sometimes the simplest explanation, the one that fits the evidence, is probably the right one. We don't always have to invent these complicated conspiracies to make sense of things.
Keep it simple, right?
Exactly.
But I gotta admit, conspiracy theories are kind of fun. There's something exciting about them, you know? Does debunking them ruin the fun?
Well, they can be entertaining, that's for sure. But I think there's something even more amazing about accepting what humanity has actually accomplished.
Like, think about it. We landed on the moon, walked on another planet. That's incredible.
It really is, and it represents so much. Years of scientific research, incredible engineering, and just plain human bravery. Those are things worth celebrating, don't you think?
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the moon landing conspiracy theories, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
Don't ever stop questioning. Don't ever lose that curiosity. But when you question things, do it with an open mind. Be willing to look at the evidence, and don't be afraid to be a little skeptical.
And who knows, maybe you'll discover that real life is even more amazing than any conspiracy theory.
That's the best part. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and see where it takes you. You never know what you might find.